Good day, everyone. It's Alan Schimmel, DevOps.com Security Boulevard. Thanks for joining us on another webinar today. We have a really good security webinar today, brought to us by our friends at Thycotic. It's a survey. It's based on a survey that was done over the summer in August at Black Hat in Las Vegas. And it was a hacker survey report on what hackers really think about your cyber defenses. We're very lucky to be joined by Joe Carson, who's going to do some analysis and lay it out for us here. But before we do, let me just quickly give you some of the ground rules we'll be following. Number one, we do use the GoToWebinar platform here for our webinars. That means for most of you, on the top right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see the Webinar control panel. I'd like to draw your attention to two areas specifically that you may interact with, and if you do, it would make for a better webinar experience. The first section is the one marked questions. And if you hit the little downward facing arrow, or if you hit the little arrow to make it downward facing, you'll see it expand. And you can see that you can type your questions in there. What's great about this is you don't have to wait for the end of the webinar to type your questions in, and it's a mad rush as to who types it in fastest and which one gets seen and asked. If you're really interested in getting a question answered, type your question in as soon as it pops into your head. It's queued in there. We have a record of it. At the appropriate time, we can get it over to our panelists and get your questions answered. If we were to have so many questions that we can't answer them all, we have a record of it. We could email you your answers after the fact so that we at least get you an answer. So please don't wait till the end. Type your questions in real time. Sometimes we'll even take them in real time as well. Secondly, if you go down to the bottom of your control panel, you'll see a section marked chat. On our webinars, whether it be DevOps.com or Security Boulevard, we use our chat section for technical support. If for some reason maybe the audio is not working well or the slides are not advancing, something's happening, but you're still able to get to that chat section. Please feel free to type your issue or problem in there. We do have engineers standing by who will assist or try to assist you and make sure that you get the most out of your webinar that you can. So chat is for technical issues. Questions are for questions of our panelists. And lastly, let me answer this right away. This webinar is being recorded. The slides and the webinar will be available on our YouTube channel as well as the Security Boulevard website shortly after the show, shortly after the live webinar. And by shortly, I mean usually within a few hours, certainly no more than 24. With that being said, now let's get started here. As I mentioned, today's webinar is brought to us by our friends at Thycotic, and it is based on a survey they conducted at Black Hat 2018 in Las Vegas, and it's about what hackers really think about your cyber defenses. I want to introduce our speaker panelist today, Joe Carson. Joseph is a pretty well-known cybersecurity professional and ethical hacker. He's been in this industry 25 plus years. You could read his bio online. I'm not going to read it all for you, but Joe's pretty well known. He's coming to us today from I drew a blank right now from Estonia, but I forgot the city, and Joe will remind us. Joseph, are you there? Talon is the
Yes, I'm here.
That's Joe, correct. I apologize.
So I'm calling in from.
Yeah.
It is Talon, Estonia. That's correct. At the moment, it's very dark and very cold here. We're approaching our extreme winters, so it's a pleasure to kind of get some of the warmth from Florida, I guess. So,
yeah. Well, next time we'll have to bring you here in person to do. But we'll work.
Always happy.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Excellent. So it's a pleasure to be here with you and sharing some of our results from our hacker survey report. Now, Thycotic does this survey each year. We conduct these surveys and questions at the Black Hat conference, and it's really kind of for us to get an understand about what hackers are thinking about, what things that organizations are doing. So either we have different themes that we kind of look into. Sometimes we look into what technical or what controls are in place, or what organizations are doing that makes hackers' jobs more difficult. What stops them from being able to gain access? And at the same time, sometimes we kind of look into, well, what security controls or what are organizations doing that are no longer effective? What things that are organizations doing that are not working, that don't stop hackers from gaining access? So this year, we wanted to really look at what security controls hackers are able to, bypass, or also some of the techniques that they're using as well. So each year we do this survey, and we usually typically get close to around 500 survey results coming from both ethical hackers, cyber criminals, black hats, white hats, everyone that we can talk to at the conference itself. So one of the most important things, of course, Black Hat, if you're not familiar or are familiar, it's one of the largest conferences throughout the calendar year. And it brings together more than 17,000 security professionals from all over the world into Las Vegas to learn, share, and educate, and also disclose security research on the latest cyber threats, cyber attacks, vulnerabilities, and the techniques that's used to bypass security controls that's used by most governments and organizations around the world. Now, interestingly, this year they usually have different keynotes that and themes that are really trying to explore and to highlight. It was interesting. This year we had Parisa, who's Google's director of engineering, and she's also known as the security princess, delivering the keynote that really focused around the steps that we needed to improve security in complex environments and landscapes. And the really thing was around embracing the internet and also the cyber challenges in order to succeed. And things that we can't go back to what we were doing before, because those things do not work. Those security controls and traditional methods are no longer viable, and we need to embrace and move forward to the future. And it was all about bringing those professionals and leaders together to make some of those technologies safe for all citizens in the future. And Parisa was focusing around responsible disclosure, which is one of the things that Google were kind of advocating at the conference this year. So it was very interesting. Now, for me, it was kind of interesting as well, because this year we had Google leading the keynote, and then last year we also had Alex from Facebook doing the keynote. So it was interesting having two organizations from a Black Hat conference that are known for around privacy issues, especially here in the EU, where it's been a bit of a challenge since EU GDPR came out in May 2018. So one of the things I like to do is, for those who may have been at Black Hat or those who didn't get the chance to go, before I get into revealing the details and insights into the results of the survey itself, I do like to share with you some of my highlights, the things that I found at the conference, some of the sessions that I do try to get to attend in numerous sessions and also talk to numerous peers, so that you can get a bit of an insight into some of the sessions themselves that you may have missed. And if you have the opportunity in the future to catch some of these, I definitely recommend them. So the first thing was listening to William Bengston, who's a senior security engineer at Netflix. And the session he delivered during Black Hat was detecting credential compromise in AWS. And I find this very interesting. This was around many organizations are adopting and using cloud services. And this was really about how, covering the risks of credential compromise in the cloud and how major risk companies who use cloud services and infrastructure. Now, the lack of securing and protecting credentials can easily lead to costly malware, stealing resources that we've seen throughout this year with the likes of crypto mining, are also being used for destructive activities, either locking up services or preventing organizations for delivering services. Now, William had covered things around how he was actually using credential controls with privileged access, and what he was looking was around previously used IP addresses to help him aid in the detection of compromised credentials. So sometimes where a new IP address is utilized, he then compares that with a previously used behavior table along with the credentials that's been used previously to determine whether there's potential compromise or abusive attempts at their services. So I did find this session very interesting. I think it's something that many organizations can probably learn from this one about making sure that when you're using privileged accounts and privileged access, combining that along with your previously known IP address ranges can really help early warnings and early indicators of potential attempts of compromising your credentials. Now, the next session that I also find was very interesting was from Sean Metcalf. He's the founder and CTO of a company called Treemark. Now, his session was from workstation to domain administrator and was also focusing around the secure administrator administrations isn't secure and how his recommendations were around fixing it. He also kind of covered around not to rely only on multi-factor authentication as the primary security control for protecting administrator accounts. So the kind of areas that he covered in his defensive pillars was around using administrative credential isolation protection, hardening administrative methods and techniques, also reducing and limiting service account rights, and as well as the effective monitoring of those. I found this session really interesting. I think it's something that you do get to hear from Sean in the future. It's definitely a session to look out for from other events that you may attend where he may be a speaker. Now, my favorite session was So I Became a Domain Controller. And this was an excellent session from Benjamin Depley, who's also known as the Gentle Kiwi. He is the author of Mimikatz. Many of you may be familiar with Mimikatz, which is a well-known solution and tool that is also comes as part of Kali Linux and downloadable that allows you to utilize. It's considered a Windows security audit tool that allows you to basically pull hashes and then use that in order to try and crack into the passwords themselves. Gentle Kiwi was joined with Vincent, who's the head of CERT for the NG group in France. And the session was 50 minutes long, but he went basically through where he introduced his own domain controller and using DC Sync, which is part of Mimikatz, in order to actually get his domain controller being the primary and also to sync up with the other in the environment as well. And it's very interesting to watch because it is something that many organizations are vulnerable to, and also went through some of the steps that you can use in order to help defend and protect against those. So this was something, these sessions were great to learn and listen to, and also get to hear some of the peers. So these are just a sample of the sessions that occurred during Black Hat. So moving into the main theme is the actual survey results from the hackers in the industry to what they think about the current cyber defenses that organizations are using. So to kind of give you some of the kind of overall summary itself, we conduct this each year. It also, many of the actual respondents was interestingly, they consider themselves as white hats. Now, one of the things I think that we overly use the term hacker. Definitely in the media, it gets used quite significantly. And I think one of the things and lessons that I learned from doing this particular research is that hackers, I myself am a hacker. I'm an ethical hacker. I use my hacking skills in order to identify weaknesses and then report those weaknesses to make sure that organizations take the right steps to protect themselves. And one of the things I find is that most of the hackers in the world are actually good hackers. They have the good intentions. And this was reflected at the Black Hat conference itself, where we had, a large number of the hackers, 70% of the hackers here actually consider themselves as helping organizations, doing the right things. They're white hats. They're actually using their skills for good. So the majority of hackers in the world are actually good individuals using their skills for good reasons. Now, the interesting also was that 30% of those hackers admitted to potentially breaking laws. Now, when we consider that, they are actually breaking the laws in order to actually help organizations. They're actually putting their foot over the line in order to kind of get to understand the weaknesses, get to understand the vulnerabilities and exploits, and using those for good intentions, not for criminal activities. So this was another interesting area that I find that, and the problem with this area is that those hackers themselves who are doing the right thing in order to identify weaknesses and risks within solutions and also within data disclosures, is that they don't get recognized for their work. They're putting their careers and their own jobs in the lines to actually help identify weaknesses. So while they do put their foot over the line between breaking the law, their intentions and their purposes and goals is actually for the greater good, as you would say. And only 5% of the hackers at the conference actually identify themselves as black hats, as true black hats, where their intention is actually for malicious purposes of breaking the law for personal gain. So this is an indicator that I think that we just need to sit back and really think about that. Yes, hackers themselves, while the majority of hackers are good, there's only a small amount of hackers who are doing criminal activities, and we have to get into using the terminology correctly. Hackers is a skill set. It's a knowledge and a method in order to be able to identify new skills, to find weaknesses, or to be able to gain access to systems and data. It's cyber criminals, which would be criminal hackers, that are using their skills for malicious activities. And we really need to call out cyber criminals more accordingly, more accurately when we're referring to those bad actors versus the good hackers. So this is something that kind of was very identified during the event, and something I thought to share with you. So yes, majority hackers are good, including myself. Now, the thing that also identified was, and it's kind of counter to the common saying that we have, that always stay up to date, always stay patched, always make sure you deploy the latest security updates, make sure you keep systems up to date. And one of the things that was identified was that even fully patched and fully up to date systems, and specifically Windows 10, were easily conquered by hackers. They were easily able to gain access to them. And this is quite concerning because, it's counterintuitive to what we're all saying is, keeping systems patched and up to date. And in fact, 50% of the hackers actually conquered Windows 10 and Windows 8 in the past year, more than any other operating system. So, and this goes against, and these were fully patched, up-to-date systems. So sometimes you kind of think that you're staying up to date, and it doesn't necessarily mean that your systems are secured. Doesn't necessarily mean that patching your systems is going to protect you from malicious actors or people from getting access to your systems. If we kind of break it down to the actual details themselves, that Windows 10 and Windows 8 was combined almost 50% of the systems that were easily accessible, with Windows 10 being 7%, Windows 8 not being far behind, and then Linux OS followed. So Linux operating systems were not too far behind that. And what surprisingly was that actually less than 5% listed Mac OSs, Unix, and mobile devices as the devices that they targeted or were able to compromise. Of course, we do see mobility on the rise and on the increase, but they tend to still go for the more traditional, thicker clients that are running Windows 10 and Windows 8. And this is more likely because, of course, of the popularity and install base, and also the global usage. So, organizations do tend to be using more Mac OSs or more Linux environments. However, by creating malware or creating toolkits in order to gain access to Windows means that they're able to use that against more organizations globally. So this is some of the indicators of why Windows continues to be the number one targeted and the number one way of gaining access to organizations' environments. And this goes to kind of confirm again that 73% of hackers actually say that traditional perimeter security and firewalls and antivirus are irrelevant or obsolete. Now, I kind of not quite agree with this myself. I think that they're irrelevant, probably yes. Obsolete, probably no. I think that the problem is that what the indicator here is that these tools, antivirus and firewalls, by themselves are not enough. They're not the only things you should rely on to keep your organizations safe and protected. So you need to make sure that you're using additional. You need to augment. You need to enhance those traditional security perimeters with more advanced and more later technology, because these by themselves are not enough. It means that you still must be doing them, but however, you shouldn't just rely on those tools to keep you secure and safe. You need to add more advanced options and additional options to make sure the organizations are protected. Another area that was significant was around that 80% of hackers say that the human is most responsible for security breaches. There's the human aspect. Humans are involved, and actually almost majority of the breaches and incidents that occur. It's not to say that they're actually involved unknowingly. It's that they are unknowing victims. They are part of the actually incident path or the attack path that's been used. So this is important that we have to make sure that humans are part of any cybersecurity strategy. It means that we have to really get to understand about the actual usage, how hackers and cybercriminals target the human, and what we can do to make sure that the human plays a more important role on the front line. We need to empower humans in the organization to be more vocal, and also give them the tools and skills to be early indicators or early warnings and alarms of potential malicious activity or suspicious activity. I think the human side of things, we can't only rely on technology. We have to make sure that we invest equally in people. And this is one of those indicators that we get as well from the results. By having this, it means that 50% of hackers say social engineering is the fastest way to access privileged accounts. And this is 56%. And one of the reasons is that, probably traditional methods are going through the firewalls, are going, basically through web servers and so forth, or even the physical, breaking the physical boundaries, is more costly and more time consuming. So using social engineering is an easy way cheap way in order to get humans to give up their credentials and give up their access. So basically, and also allows the hackers and cyber criminals to do it remotely, to do it across borders, in order to gain access to organizations' privileged accounts. And one of the reasons why privileged accounts are targeted is because privileged accounts allows hackers and cyber criminals to get away with the activity. It allows them to hide their tracks and also remain in these organizations for longer periods of time. So followed by that, application OS vulnerabilities still continue to be highly used. Identity theft is on the increase, where we're seeing identity theft growing and being able to reuse and abuse credentials and identities. And then less than 70% was malware or stolen devices being used to gain access. And this is kind of interesting, kind of seeing where the direction and things are moving. And if we look into some of the common social engineering scams, is around phishing attempts. For example, we look at this particular one. This was used in over 1 million instances in 2016. And this one was actually sending a image of an attachment, or what looked like attachment. And behind that attachment was actually a hyperlink. And that hyperlink took you to a login page where then the user, in order to gain access to the attachment, would enter their credentials again. However, entering the credentials was simply giving the cyber criminal their user ID and password. It was handing it over unknowingly, because they were assuming, of course, they're looking at an urgent invoice. However, they were simply just passing along the credentials. They could then be used and synced up with the email, and then be able to access and elevate privileges much later. And another major area that we have as the human side is number one source of cyber fatigue, is remembering and changing passwords. What's growing is, of course, so we've got, go back 10, 15 years, we had typically 1 or 2 accounts in order to gain access to systems. You either had one username and password for your email account, and maybe one email and password, or username and password for your Active Directory NT account. Move forward to 2018 and 2019, where now the average person has almost more than 30 accounts, meaning they have multiple passwords and multiple user IDs they need to remember. And this means that we have typical bad behavior and poor use. So with passwords being the number one source of cyber fatigue, this means that actually the highest risk that we have that is actually reported, what is the riskiest behavior by employees? And that is the reuse of passwords. Reusing the same passwords or simple variations of these passwords significantly increases the risk. And therefore, it means that, by basically brute force or guessing passwords is quite common today, where many hackers and cyber criminals are able to simply go into online forums, download these huge password troves of previously leaked passwords of previous data breaches, and it's very easy to find commonalities and find trends of passwords that's been used, which are able to then guess the password to gain access. or that you may basically are using passwords across multiple, and only takes one of those accounts that you're using to be part of a breach that allows the cyber criminal to then use that password to gain access to your other accounts. And also by using simple variations, by using incremental numbers or dates to try and keep it current. So this is the biggest area of risk for many organizations when it comes to the human aspect, is reused passwords. Of course, USB devices, we have still a major risk of people picking up or sharing USB devices between people and between the systems, meaning that one USB connected to one system and used to share a file to another system can simply make a piece of malware or remote access tool spread itself out into multiple systems and multiple organizations. It continues to be a major issue. Of course, accessing work and systems through public Wi-Fi. I can tell you a story. Just a few weeks ago, I do travel quite a lot, and I was sitting on a plane, and next to me on the plane was an individual who was looking at his laptop. And this was a major senior executive at a major organization globally, who was known to be, not this person, but companies known to be part of multiple major incidents in the past, 5-6 years. And this person sat and typed their password next to me, looked at their confidential financial reports of the past quarter, and also I watched him type in their PIN number to the phone. So sitting next to a person on a plane using the internet on the plane itself, was typing in the password on the laptop and their phone and looking at sensitive information in public. And this is something that we continue to be, of course, we're working on the go, we're moving all the time, we need to be always connected, but it increases a major risk that employees continue to do is using devices and accessing public Wi-Fi. You always have to assume that using public Wi-Fi that somebody's always watching. Somebody's looking over your shoulder, or somebody's looking at the data as it travels through that access point securely. So we have to be aware of those risks. But these are the areas that we find that was the riskiest behavior by employees, and something that we should be looking at how to make sure that we put the right security in place to prevent these from being potential stepping stones to major incidents in organizations. And we also looked at, if you're basically using a lot of the built-in security controls within Windows, many organizations are, enabling, things like BitLocker, or they're using Windows Defender, or they're using GPO and SSEM and Active Directory to manage privileges and manage accounts. And one of the things we find that in this particular case is if you're still using only, the controls that's built into the operating system, that 91% of the hackers were able to easily exploit environments that were only using GPO, group policy, to manage privileges. So one of the important things here, and we can look at some of those areas, that 43% were using tools like Mimikatz, which of course I mentioned earlier was Simple Kiwi, was the author, using Mimikatz in order to exploit GPOs. Easily actually exploiting GPOs by misconfigurations. Or also others were using it, finding passwords in sysvolume, or even the problem with group policy preferences, with 22% of the time. So even if you were using, the built-in security controls within Windows, that hackers and cyber criminals are still easy to bypass those. And the important message here is that it's very clear that we should not be using, only one vendor type of security controls. We need to actually de-risk. We need to make sure that we actually do defense in depth. We need to augment the security controls and expand them further. So it means that clearly here that they're using GPO to protect your privileges within Active Directory, but you do need to augment and do need to expand on it further to make sure that you're actually, it's good for managing, but not so good for security. So it's important lessons that we're learning from this. So I think this is a clear message that we have from hackers and cyber criminals out there. The next area as well was we wanted to see how good organizations are moving to least privilege approach. And the least privilege approach is really one of those first steps into, for example, we always hear the term zero trust. And zero trust is something that is about verification, re-verification, and building trust dynamically in order to allow systems, users access to networks and environments and services within the organization. And of course, it's been really mandated and pushed by many compliance and regulations out there. And for example, in EU GDPR, you have, these privilege requirements, things around PCI compliance and ISO, and the California Consumer Data Privacy Act as well, also coming out, Cyber Essentials in the UK. They really do demand least privilege enforcement, meaning that you only need to give enough privileges for that person or application or service account in order to perform the task at hand. And one of the biggest indicators here was that organizations are not doing a very good job. 70%, 5% of hackers are saying that they're not doing a good job of implementing a least privilege strategy approach. And this is really important because not just is it required by compliance and regulations, this is also one of the best security controls out there to actually reduce the threat and risks of cybercrime. So with this, I think it's really important that organizations really take a step back and really think about the implementation of the least privilege strategy. I think this is an area that organizations can probably learn and probably do a much more effective way at reducing the risks. The next area is around default vendor passwords. Is one of the areas that hackers do say is the easiest way and best way to elevate privileges. And I'll give an example of that is that, about 2 years ago, I was actually doing a penetration test in a power station. And in doing that penetration test in the power station, I went through all the security controls. And when I went through the security controls, I was quite impressed. The physical controls are amazing. The security around the engines, around the command and control center, I couldn't fault them. They were using all the latest security devices, advanced threat protection on SCADA controls. All of the actual systems and PLCs were enclosed and locked cabinets. All the cables were in pipes that I could not access. There was no, kind of available USB that I could simply plug in and try to take over a system. And it wasn't until I found a piece of paper that was sitting on the table next to one of the actually analyst desks that actually had all the usernames and passwords of all the security systems that they had in the environment. And I looked at, and I even found out that those usernames and passwords were the default vendor. So you're looking at a power station with all the latest advanced, up-to-date technology that are meant to protect it. And at the same time, they're sitting with basically the doors wide open with the default credentials of the vendor installed solutions. And again, we go back to this and we said time and time again that hackers do say that the default vendor passwords is still the best way. And we really need to get away with this. We need to get to better improvement. We need to be able to remove default vendor passwords before they get into production. And of course, we have seen California, introduce plans for legislation in the future to make sure that default vendor passwords and credentials are changed immediately. Of course, that's from a consumer perspective or from a hardware perspective, but we also need to really look at this from previously deployed systems to make sure that we move away from the default credentials and vendors and passwords so they're no longer an issue in the future. Can we go through and look at this a bit more in detail? Where 22% was focused on the default vendor passwords, but also app and applications and operating system vulnerabilities continue to be a major issue. Misconfigured service accounts, of course, by not making sure you put quotes or breaking informations around the service accounts. Social engineering was also a popular way in order for escalating privileges. Shared accounts, and then brute force attacks was right at the bottom there, 7%. So this is something that we need to really look at in order to see what we can do to improve and make sure that none of these become a major issue and a weakness for organizations in the future. The next area we looked at was around what types of accounts do hackers prefer. Now this one was a bit of a surprise to me. The main accounts, accounts they enable the ability to hide and allow hackers to rule the network, to go wherever they want to gain access to systems as they wish. And we kind of look at some of the other responses was around things. Of course, service accounts were very popular. root accounts. These were very surprising for me because when I'm doing penetration tests or I'm doing ethical hacking, I prefer to target the less noisy accounts. I prefer to go after accounts which are walking around the walls, more local administrator accounts or built-in accounts that are there for service reasons, rather than going straight to these accounts which are very noisy and typically monitored by organizations. So my preference is to kind of go in at a bit of lower end and kind of walk around the walls and then try to laterally move into the network using a much more kind of under the cover, under the radar accounts, which are typically not monitored, less noisy for me to perform. But I guess that's sometimes a difference between different hacking techniques. Is some prefer to go to the main goal quickly if they do identify the organization is not putting the right controls or right security in place. In my case, I prefer to be a bit less noisy, a little bit more cautious, I would say, and try to go through a much more kind of under the radar approach by using local administrator accounts. And this kind of goes to say that 32% of hackers do report that privileged access and privileged accounts are the number one choice for gaining access to this sensitive data. And one of the reasons why privileged accounts are one of the main targets is that this type of account allows them to get away with a crime. No hacker or no cybercriminal wants to be caught. They don't want to be detected. They want to stay hidden. And it's a privileged account which is the difference between being detected and staying hidden. If you're able to gain access to a privileged account, it means that you can actually create other accounts. You can change configurations. You can change the security configuration. You can create remote access in order to gain continuous access into the organization. You can delete log files. You can modify log files. So privileged accounts are the main accounts that allow you to return easily, to delete your tracks and stay hidden. And they do continue to be the number one choice for hackers and cyber criminals. Second to privileged accounts, not far behind, is email access. Now we look at email access today. Email access continues to be, a really sought after account as well. And the main reason why email access is that it's our digital footprint. If we consider in today's world, when I started my career back in the early 90s, email was simply just a message that you would send to a colleague or peer. And today, an email is so much more. An email is when you log into, where you log in from. It is access to your email accounts themselves, the actual data, access to your browser preferences, your browsing history, your location information, your sensitive documents, your photographs, your calendar, your contact information, where you've been and where you're going to. It's really kind of your digital identity online. When hackers and cybercriminals are able to gain access to that, they can simply become you. They know what services you're using. They can reset your password for other accounts because it all comes into that one location. And this is they can also determine what services you're using from your email access. So yes, privileged accounts are the number one in order to be able to elevate and get away with a crime. And email access is basically a way to get access to privileged accounts through your digital identity and your digital footprint. So these are things that we have to be really cautious and aware of that really do allow cyber criminals and hackers to really gain access to organizations very easily. Now, some of the key takeaways that we have from this report itself, I think it's something that we can look at as the key takeaways themselves. Is the number one is around adapting a zero trust posture. And for me, is something that I think the organizations need to look at, because I don't say zero trust is the goal. Zero trust is where you start from. It's a starting point. If you're able to look at your organization, you can define either trusted networks or untrusted networks. Either by things where the devices they're accessing. Those are corporate devices where you have security controls in place. And then, of course, you've got BYOD or contractors or third parties, which devices where you're giving access to services. You can use zero trust in order to be a starting point. that you have to verify. Everyone has to verify their accounts and verify their identities and verify their devices. And then basically based on those continuous verifications and also maybe peer reviews or multi-factor authentication or security controls that's in place, you can then build a trust score or a risk score that helps you identify how systems are accessing and what security is in place during that access. And really allowing a zero posture to be the starting point that organizations can get to what I refer to as more adaptive security controls or dynamic security controls. Security controls that increase and decrease based on the threat landscape that's out there. So I think these are the things that organizations can relate to in a zero trust posture, along with privilege access, along with the least privilege approach, the principle of least privilege, and also multi-factor authentication. All of those can be the key mechanisms to continuously verify trust, make sure that privileges are the minimum in the organization that they need to be to perform those tasks, and then make sure that you actually have a much more secure, much more resilient organization around this. So the number one key takeaway is around that zero trust posture. The second key takeaway is around, if do not rely only on GPO for security. GPO is great at managing policies and rules and processes in place, but by itself, it's not enough for security. Just like I mentioned earlier, that traditional firewalls and antivirus software is no longer sufficient by themselves to keep the organization secure. GPO is also not enough and by itself to keep the organization secure. So you do have to augment and enhance it much further in order to make sure that you're able to have a much more secure and resilient organization. And again, in addition to the zero trust posture, I did mention the principle of least privilege, making sure that one of the things that I was many years ago as a domain administrator for 100,000 servers. I had one account that was able to access and log into every one of those servers across the environment. I was able to perform my job. I was able to troubleshoot and fix things very quickly. However, I realized much later, as I moved more into my security hat and my security career, that type of activity, me having an account that has full access to everything, by itself was good at being able to solve problems and troubleshoot and fix issues, but it actually was a major security issue. So this is really where least privilege approach that I realized that I should never ever have a domain account that has access to all those servers. I should have a normal standard account, which is applying the principle of least privilege that I am able to use in order to verify my identity. But then using the least privilege approach, meaning that account, I'm able to do things I need to do. However, that account by itself cannot log into the servers. I need to go and elevate that account to the right privileges to perform administrative tasks, meaning either one-time passwords or time-based elevation or peer reviews or different controls that that the account itself always stays the same level, but it's the actions themselves are elevated. And this is where we really need to look at the principle of least privilege to make sure that we're able to apply the right controls, and making sure that we're able to, meaning that if my account is ever compromised, the actual attacker cannot use that account to abuse the organization without have been able to break the additional security controls in place. And this is some of the key things that we have around this. I did just complete a book recently, which will be published in January of next year, that really focuses around least privilege security. So I do recommend, in the near future, if you're interested in learning more about that topic, to do keep an eye out for my book that will be made available in January of next year. The next story, we look at, the core of this and the background of this is really around privilege accounts and privilege access. And earlier in June, Gartner identified as privilege access management being the number one project in 2018. And I think it's really important to step back and think about why this actually is the number one project in 2018. And if we think about one of the things as we went through the results, the things around that hackers and cybercriminals have reported in the things during Black Hat. If we look at some of these things that organizations are trying to achieve, that privilege access, it helps organizations reduce costs. It's one of the few security solutions out there. Most security solutions are reactive. They are there as as a checkbox. They are there because they're simply basically reduce the risk. But if we look at security itself, security has to be good for business. It has to be actually contributing to the business. And there's very few security solutions out there that actually helps reduce the cost. So privileged access helps actually organizations automate. It helps employees be much faster at actually accessing critical systems more securely. And this in turn helps organizations save companies time and money. So this is a major area. The second reason why it's the number one project in 2018 is it empowers happy employees. One of the things I mentioned around is actually employees taking risks in the organization by reusing passwords. People putting in place the default credentials of solutions out there, not changing those credentials enough. As I mentioned about the power station, using those default vendor credentials and printing them on a piece of paper for ease of use. People tend to cut corners in order to be able to do their jobs much more effectively. And in the past, of course, when security was controls were put in place, it usually creates tension between the IT security and the employees. And actually, privileged access is one of those areas that actually helps empower happy employees. It helps reduce cyber fatigue. It helps take one of the biggest pains of actually having to remember and change passwords away from employees, allowing them to focus more time on their job, more time on what they need to be doing, rather than actually time wasted in actually doing things that doesn't help them in their business and doesn't help them in their performance. And again, this ultimately results in a positive security impact. CISOs are under pressure more than ever before. They're under pressure to secure the organization, to make sure that organizations are compliant and keeping in line with regulations such as GDPR and keeping in compliance with Cyber Essentials or NIST or California privacy. All of these are forcing CISOs to really kind of try to look at, putting the hammer down and making sure that it's much more restrictive. But privileged access management is one of those areas that helps actually create a positive impact. CISOs want to make sure that they're doing something that's both good for the people and good for the business, and not just a reactive approach to the industry. And privileged access is one of those areas that actually creates a positive security impact in the business. That's a solution that is both good for the employee and also good for the business, both reducing that cyber fatigue and reducing costs. And this is something that all CISOs should really look to in order to make sure they're having an effective contribution to the business itself. The next area, as I mentioned, is on compliance itself. We have so many compliances with so many things that we need to go through, audits, whether it's PCI, ISO, and all the others that I mentioned throughout the call. All of those have a requirement to actually manage and protect privileged access and privileged accounts themselves. And this is really kind of where a privileged access solution can help automate and reduce the complexity. It helps to fast track the compliance by making sure rather than taking a checkbox approach, you can take a much more security focused approach that is around doing the right thing, that in turn actually speeds and actually makes at the same time organizations more compliant. At the same time, my job and my goal is to really make my job more difficult. This is ultimately one of the things I want to try and achieve. It's what I try to do at all of the research I do at Black Hat each year, is looking at what works and what doesn't work. What controls that actually are effective at making cyber criminals' jobs more difficult and hackers' jobs more difficult. What things that organizations are doing that are not effective, that basically are easily bypassed and easily circumvented. And we want to make sure that we share that results and share those research with you, so you can see what works and see what doesn't work, and then give you the right education, right tools in order to really help your organizations be more secure in the future. Ultimately, at the same time, doing a positive impact for the business, but at the same time, making my job more difficult when I come and do penetration tests or ethical hacks. In the future, that I see that you're doing the right thing, and ultimately, my job takes more time and more effort, and I always look for other ways, of course, to gain access. But at the same time, the goal here is make my job more difficult And that's why I'm sharing with you kind of my techniques and my peers' techniques, and that we find that are most effective and most challenging. And if you want to learn more about some of these ways and methods, we do have a book that's available for download. It's a digital book that is around privileged account management for dummies. It is also for smart people. So it's a book that purpose is to simplify the topic and give you the knowledge and education in order to prepare an organization for the journey to managing and protecting privileged accounts and privileged access. This book itself, it's a very quick read, and anyone in the organization, from a CISO right down to IT security or IT administrators, will gain value from this book itself. And it will really take you on a journey to preparation in order to make sure that you look at your organization, look at what things you can do and put in place, as I mentioned previously, around the benefits that, of course, Gartner has mentioned, and also the things that make my job more difficult. And this is the intention of that book, in order to give you those skills. And if there's one message that I find, of speaking at many conferences globally and also doing a lot of workshops, and also from listening to the feedback that I had from my peers at Black Hat, was that we really need to empower people. We need to empower employees. We need to give them a voice. It's clear that technology is not the only solution, and we need a technology, people, and process solution. We need something that works all together. It's something that's simple and something that's effective. And it means that we need to invest equally in people as we do technology for a really effective solution in the future. And one of the key messages that I find that if organizations wanted to make a quick change to make a much more effective and much more secure organization, the one message that I do have is make sure your employees are not afraid to ask for advice. Make sure that if they see something suspicious, that they're not trying to hide it. If we victimize employees, they will try to hide things. They will try to hide when they click on the malicious link, or when they accidentally type in the password into somewhere that's suspicious. We want to make sure that employees have the ability to, one is identify indicators of compromise, and at the same time be vocal. If they see something suspicious or they did something that may have been suspicious, make sure they're not afraid to go and ask a peer, a colleague, a boss, a cyber ambassador for advice. These are some of the things that if we make sure that employees are more vocal, then therefore you will actually help identify incidents much earlier. One of the things that I find is that if I get to an organization that's done some type of cyber awareness training, and I'm doing a phishing scam or some type of phishing attempt, if they're basically more vocal, then my time frame becomes less. Excuse me. And this is one of the key things, is if people are more talkative in the organization, then you will identify these types of attacks much earlier. And it can simply be basically the difference between a simple incident or something that an employee does try to hide, which could then lead to major cyber catastrophe. So make sure your employees are talkative and are more empowered to ask for advice, to ask peers for information and share knowledge together. And this ultimately comes to one of my final messages, is that we're only as secure as the people around us. I understand when I travel or when I work with people that I'm only secure as they are, because ultimately we're all connected, either through basically the devices in the same area or basically the social presence that we have. So a secure internet is only secure as the people around you, and therefore the best way for me to protect myself is to make sure the people around me are protected and safe and knowledgeable. So this is why one of my messages, a secure internet starts with you. It starts with the people around you, and therefore the more you make them secure and more you make them safe, then ultimately it leads to much more safer environments. And this is key for organizations. And this is the key message. If you're an organization, you're only secure as the people around you in that business. So therefore, it's important that we make sure that we share that information and we make organizations more secure. So at that point, I'm going to open up for questions. We have a few minutes for some questions. So I checked the question, and also if there's other questions that have been asked before, please share them with me.
Sure.
All right, Joseph, thank you very much. That was, as I expected from you, actually, a great in-depth professional look at this. And it was also beyond just the survey. It was, well, for many of us who don't get a chance to go out in August to Vegas for Security Summer Camp, as it's called,
Yep.
you know, it was good to kind of get a flavor for Black Hat and the kind of stuff we see there. Let's ask a couple questions from the audience. One is from Charles, and he wants to know, could you please break down when you talk about 80% of breaches are due to human responsibility statistic? What specifically was are the problems there, such as not up to
It really comes down.
Yeah.
Correct. It comes down to that it's multiple challenges. Is that there's a human involvement. Either the human clicked on a link in an email that ultimately then leads to let's say a ransomware infection, or they open up an attachment, or they type in their credentials into a compromised, risky website, or they didn't, they prevented their system from rebooting that didn't effectively allow that patch to be applied. So what I'm saying is that there was a human element into many of the incidents and breaches that we've experienced each year. And 80% of those, if the human was able to, if they allowed that patch to be installed, or they were able to identify the website that were entering the credentials in was malicious. It's not that they're knowingly doing it, they're unintentionally doing it. There's only a few incidents that are knowingly involving insiders. Those are the intentional ones that do occur. But majority of incidents, there is a human element of it. And one of the reasons why there's a human element is, of course, that reduces the cost of the hacker or cybercriminal much hugely. It makes their costs simplified than trying to create backdoors or trying to create malicious or trying to use 0 days, for example. So yes, 80% is multiple human elements into an incident in itself.
Great. Next question from Sesh. How do I convert privileged user management into a configuration that I can set correctly at the time that infrastructure is stood up and that I can check out and remediate continuously? Good question.
So it's a very good question, and it's something that is actually, you have to get into the life cycle of it. It's a life cycle management process. So one of the things I do recommend is you get into looking at privileged access from a life cycle approach. And actually the book that I mentioned, the Privileged Account Management for Dummies, does take some of those practices into place. So you get into what you have is you've got managed and unmanaged privileged accounts. And you're always going to have that life cycle when you spin up new software, or you spin up, let's say, even virtual machines or cloud services, or things are getting kind of moved around, or you get recovery systems backing up and restoring and so forth. You're always going to have privileged accounts appearing sporadically, or you have privileged accounts sprawl when you're doing those configurations. The important thing is to have a life cycle in order to identify. So you can do things around discovering and strategies and best practices that will help you identify what accounts you have under your control of management, and those accounts which I refer to sometimes unmanaged. And the goal really is to continuously do what I refer to as a risk-based assessment, continuous risk-based assessment, and you want to continually move the higher risk accounts into your managed secured policies. So that's a continuous process, but it does mean looking at, I do recommend a webinar that I did a while back, which is called Privileged Access Management 101, Back to Basics. And that actually, in that webinar, there's a very good kind of process that I recommend that is all about this life cycle of managing and protecting privileged accounts. And it will probably give you a really good where do you start and the journey that you need to go on in order to create this as a continuous life cycle and a continuous process, so that you make sure that as new systems are updated and infrastructure is being deployed and changed, that it helps you get into effectively managing those accounts on a continuous basis.
Got it. Joseph, that brings us right up here against the top of the hour. So I know we had a few more questions in line, but we'll have to save them and get them out another time. We'll get them over to you, but let me just 30 seconds real quick. Thank you so much, honestly, for a great security webinar today. I hope both the people who are live as well as the people who will listen to this on YouTube and on Security Boulevard over the coming weeks and months really appreciate the work that goes into this and frankly your expertise on it. Thank you very, very much. Thanks to Thycotic for sponsoring today's webinar. Of course, you can find out more information in the slide here. You get a little bit of background, but you really should check out some of their solutions. Highly recommend them. Me personally, having been in security for a long time. But that's going to call it a wrap on this webinar today from Security Boulevard, DevOps.com. Thanks for joining us. This is Alan Schimmel. Have a great day, everyone, and we'll see you soon on another webinar.